there's our project. All of this constraints work you're going to do in the storyboard. So there's nothing you need to worry about with constraints in code. It's all just buttons in storyboard, hitting them in the right order, and all that kind of stuff. There's a handful of different ways to do constraints. I'm going to show you the basics. If you're trying to do something a little bit more complicated from a layout perspective than what I'm going to show you today, just grab office hours or tutors or Google to get you through to the more complex stuff. The good news about Googling is that constraints are relatively new in Xcode. So just about any result you find will still be relevant. You've probably already run into this before when you're doing some like coding stuff in our class. When you try Googling, sometimes the stuff is just like totally wackadoodle compared to how we're doing it in class, or it's really old school or whatever. The good news is constraints, you don't have that much of a problem there. All right, so I'm going to throw a couple assets on the storyboard so we can see the problem with constraints. And you've probably already run into this problem a little bit. But let's say I wanted my layout to look like this, where I have a label on the left-hand side and a button on the right-hand side. Down here, this is telling me, we haven't looked at this right here, but down here at the bottom, this is telling me what device this preview is in. And so this is an iPhone 13 Pro, which is a big dog. But if I go and look at it on a little iPhone SE, you'll see that the button is like off the side because it's not as many pixels, okay? So down here is how you can kind of preview what different devices might look like. I'll go back to the big guy. And so what we need to do is make it so these things are not on specific pixels, but are being placed in relationship to other things on the screen. So that as the screen changes size, they all kind of squash and stretch properly to fit. You probably also run into the problem where you have like a label and it goes ... because your label isn't big enough, right? Or we looked at the Pokemon thing where if you have like a paragraph of text, I was just like, just make a really tall text box and don't put anything underneath it and it'll be fine. But what you want to do is when there's a long paragraph, it like moves like this in height and the buttons or whatever move along and kind of hug the bottom of it. Does that make sense? You with me with this problem? Okay, great. So that's where constraints come in. So how constraints work is that you have an anchor point, like one object is always in one particular place. And then every other object on the screen, you kind of define in relationship to that anchor object. Are you with me? Okay. And you provide at least 3 different measurements for every object on screen. And that fourth, it just kind of adjusts what it needs to do. So the 3 different things you can control are X, Y, height, and width. So you're going to either say, you got to basically define 3 of those things, and then the fourth one is the one that adjusts. So you might say, okay, this object starts at this point on the x-axis, and this point on the y-axis, and is the width of the screen. And then if it needs to get bigger or smaller, it will use height to adjust that, right? Or if the screen gets smaller, then it's just the width of the screen, which is a variable. So as the screen gets smaller, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. You don't say like the width is exactly a certain number of pixels in that example. You say it's in relationship to the total size of the screen. Make sense so far? Cool? Okay. So the good practice that I have found to work with constraints really well is if you start in the upper left-hand side and work your way to the lower right-hand side. So you use the upper left-hand most object as the anchor point that everything else is based on. And then you just kind of work object by object down and across until you get down to the lower right-hand side. Cool? So we're going to do a really simple layout here, which is just a label and a button, and I'll show you how that works. So first, I'm going to take my label, which is going to be my upper left-hand corner, and down here, you have this thing that kind of looks like a square inside of crosshairs. The icon looks like this. Something like that. So got little stuff in the corners too. That's that. And when you roll over, it says add new constraints. So I select the first object and hit add new constraints, and it pops up this little box. And it says, okay, I think this is what you got. So the first box right here is the upper edge. You can see this little square represents the object. And it's saying, hey, the distance from the top of the screen to where you are right now is 24 pixels. That's not measuring from up here. It's measuring from just below the notch. So it's measuring like this space from here to there is 24 pixels. And I'll be like, okay, that's about right. So I'm going to lock that in. And I do that by clicking on the little measurement so it turns dark red. And then it's saying, all right, well, I think from the left-hand side is 52 units. Is that right? Yeah, I locked that in. And then this is where it gets a little tricky. What's the third thing you're going to give it? Well, I could give it a whole bunch of different things. I could say, hey, the right edge is 363 pixels over, but then if my word gets longer than just LABEL, it'll start truncating. So what I'm going to do is give it width, or I'm sorry, not give it width. I'm going to lock this in, but I'm going to say go all the way up to 100 units from the right-hand side. And so now you can see it creates a text box, and the blue things are the constraints. It creates a text box that's much wider and will always be 100 units over from the right-hand side. And will get taller depending on if it needs to be, if there's more words in there. If I set the lines to 0, it'll now get the height is not defined, so it can make it as tall as it wants. So when I go smaller, you can see that there's still 100 units of margin over here on the right-hand side. You with me so far? We're good? Okay, now let's get this button. I'll do the same thing. You click on the button and then click on the add new constraints. And this is where it gets a little tricky. See how this measurement is a number? If I hit the little down arrow on it, it will say, what are we measuring from? And so after the first object, everything else you want to be based on some other object or its relationship to the first object. And so what I'm saying is I want to measure not from the entire view, not from what they call the safe area, which is the area below the notch, but I want to measure from the other object, this label. So I'm going to, it guesses and usually does a pretty good job. So today it did, but sometimes it'll get that wrong. Sure. So I'm going to hit label, and it's some odd number there. I'm just going to say an even 20 units down from the label. Then on the right-hand side, I want it to hug the right edge of the screen. So I'm going to say, all right, from the safe area, come in, instead of 78, let's make it an even 100 so it lines up with the width of the label above it. And there we go. And so now it'll be over 100 units from this edge. And then I need a third thing. Now the third thing could be the left side, but then if it gets like, if the left side is hardwired in at 200 and something pixels over here, that as the screen gets smaller, the button's going to get more and more narrow, which is awkward. So I need a third thing, and an easy one is just say width. So I'll lock the width in on this one at 75 and make the button a little bit bigger and just give it an even 100 units wide. And hit add 3 constraints. And now that button is however many units I said down from the label. It's over from the side, and it's always this width. And I can preview that it works right by changing my size from a big guy to a little guy, and you'll see it's still 100 units over from the side and doesn't get all squishy or weird. Make sense? A good workflow for this is pick a size device that you think is going to be the most common size device that your user's going to have. And so it's probably not the Pro Max versions, because those are the really big ones. But pick just a common size that you think most of your users are going to use. In a real agency or firm that's building these things, you actually get the measure, you get the analytics that will tell you what's the most popular iPhone that your product is, and you'll pick that. But you'll design it for the ideal one just by clicking and dragging like we've done. And then once you're happy with the layout,